Whether this report is current news or past news, the lumber industry is an intricate balance between supply and demand. Let me explain. Thinking of renovating this year? Think again. In March 2021, lumber was at an all-time high in North America. As demand surges and supply plummets, pine beetles, forest fires, a recession, and an increase in demand have created a perfect storm in the construction industry. There simply isn't enough wood to go around. A simple 2x4 that used to cost $2 to $3 is now $8. As people cancel their vacations because of the COVID-19 pandemic, many are choosing to finally tackle those home renovation projects they've talked about for the past decade. The price surge is expected to continue for a while. So, if you've been considering building a project, you might want to buy that new ATV instead. If there's too much supply and not enough demand, prices go down, and this can affect jobs. Alternately, if there is not enough supply but a high demand, prices are driven up. This is a sweet spot for many manufacturers and business owners, and some choose to capitalize on it by having last chance or limited quality sales strategies. Hundreds of years ago, in young America, its sister country, Canada, were busy primarily cutting down trees, clearing land, and using that wood to build their houses and ships. It took many years for the full-scale commercial forestry industry we know today to develop. Let's take a closer look at what our homesteaders did after they cleared out the land that we learned about yesterday. Finally, let's build a barn.
The big moment is here. Eager children, likely weary from being squished into a wagon or small lean-to or temporary shelter for months on the trail and now on their homestead, are itching for a space of their own with a nice soft bed. The wood has been cut, the ground has been cleared, and they are giddy with excitement as they watch Dad begin the process of building their first home. He lays the 4 logs where the walls will rise up, creating a little square. Perhaps he is building a room first. They look at one another, confusion crinkling up their noses. All day, Father lays the freshly peeled logs, going around and around his little square hut. He comes back and forth with fresh buckets of water, mixing it with the clay-like soil and pressing it in between the logs along with some moss to seal in the spaces, so no creepy, crawly spiders can get in. With arms crossed and a look of satisfaction on his face, he nods his head. It'll do. The finished cabin is solid, though it still needs a roof. It stands about 16 by 16 feet, which is 5 by 5 meters. And it is one of the first structures that a pioneer family built as they settled on their new land. Let's take a look at this timeline and see if you can figure out why they wouldn't try to build a big house right away. If everything went well with our pioneer family's journey, they arrived at their new homestead in the fall, and the clock was ticking. Depending on where they settled and what the weather was like there, they didn't have the time to make a beautiful home. Most early settlers started with a small, simple cabin that was eventually converted into a barn or shed once they had the time and materials to make a more modern dwelling. While it was surely better than a tent, wagon, or lean-to, it still meant being crammed into one room as a family. At least it was warm and dry, but there wasn't much personal space in the early days of settlement. Building considerations. As you can imagine, building houses has come a long way. But it is important to remember that even during the 1800s, advancements in building styles and the invention of the sawmill meant that houses rapidly became more and more modern. Part of the reason that early pioneer homesteads were so rustic and old-fashioned wasn't because they were so much older. Instead, it was because they had traveled 6 months away from stores and trade ports, and access to tools and supplies was limited. First-generation pioneers used wooden pegs instead of the nails and screws we have today. They notched their logs so they would sit flat on top of each other. Even during these times, knowledgeable builders and masons were popular and often came and gave advice or were hired to help build the main house. Once a pioneer family became established with a solid infrastructure in place for their garden, water, animals, and grains, they would have the time, energy, and money or goods to trade to help them build a larger, more sophisticated home. Some families even did this in stages, building a crude cabin at first, a larger home a year or two later, and eventually a much nicer home a few years after that. As more and more people expanded westward, helpful neighbors moved in, trains zoomed across freshly laid tracks, and towns became more commonplace. This meant that resources and skilled laborers increased, and it changed the face of the western frontier forever.
Building homes today. Whether you are building a rustic cabin in the woods or a modern home with hardy board siding, building today is nothing like it was 200 years ago. Each element of your home has a highly specialized, trained tradesperson who oversees it and makes sure that the work is done right. Electricians, framers, drywallers, plumbers, general contractors, and architects each bring their expertise to the table to help you build the very best home you can. Of course, quality and workmanship are not always the same from person to person, but today's buildings, codes, and requirements require certain standards to be met to ensure that the homes are safe and able to be insured by insurance companies. If you're wondering if people still build their own homes today, the answer is yes. With careful planning, helpful neighbors, the internet, right tools, anybody can build their own homestead cabin. However, even out in the woods or on the Alaskan frontier, we still have access to many modern conveniences and a lot of knowledge that the early pioneers did not have. From plastic bins full of metal nails to battery-operated drills, things will likely never be quite as difficult as it was hundreds of years ago.